Alrighty, so we have now kind of gone through the Industrial Revolution, and last lectures we focused on the causes, the impacts, the positive impacts, and the negative impacts. And all of that was kind of the heart of the 1800s. Of course, the Industrial Revolution goes on into the 1900s, but the technical dates, as we talked about earlier, 1815 to about 1875. Meanwhile, there were some negative impacts. Overall, of course, the Industrial Revolution improved people's lives dramatically. But there were a couple of glaring negatives, the labor issues, the sanitation issues. And so the progressive years, late 1800s, early 1900s, if you've taken a U.S. history class, or maybe like early, a little bit after that, those are times where people were starting to kind of challenge this idea of pure laissez-faire and figuring out, how do you balance, this great situation of the Industrial Revolution with the negative issues that need to be dealt with. And so we're going to go through a couple things here. We're going to go through two parts of the progressive years. One part is just kind of how do you deal with some of the negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution, and then there's also other elements of the progressive years, things that have to do with just cultural trends that are interesting as well. So we'll cover both of that here in this lecture. All right, so let's start with this, sanitation and health issues. So that was one of the big negatives created by the Industrial Revolution. So the first name here, I'm going to stay on the slide for a bit, is Thomas Hill Green. And Thomas Hill Green was kind of one of these early progressive thinkers who said we can't have pure laissez-faire, right? We need to have some government control of things. And so there were voices like his that challenged this kind of idea that was going on during the Industrial Revolution. Another interesting guy was a man named Edwin Chadwick. Now, Edwin Chadwick, he was from England, and he wrote this essay called on the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population. And he writes this in 1842. I didn't put the date, but it's probably worth noting. He writes this in 1842. And when he writes this in 1842, at the time when he wrote this, people were like, yeah, we're not really worried about it. And what he's saying on this essay on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population, he's basically saying that it's bad and it's going to make everybody sick. So he writes this in about 1842. Less than 10 years after that, you end up with a massive cholera epidemic inside of England, London especially. Cholera, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a pretty nasty disease. It's a type of thing that gives you it comes from unclean food, unclean water. It'll make you really sick. If it doesn't kill you, you'll want it to kill you. That's the cholera epidemic. And when that happened, people are like, ooh, problem, right? You know what people like Edwin Chadwick talked about earlier was he was right. And what does that lead to? Well, what it leads to in 1875 is what we call the Public Health Act, right? And the Public Health Act of 1875 was when now you have less laissez-faire because the government is going to come in and say, okay, no more, you're going to have to clean up your act, certain industries. So for example, in the Public Health Act, it said if you're going to build a building, you have to have running water sewage systems. Is it going to cost more to build a building? Of course, but then the building's going to be cleaner. Another part of the Public Health Act was just sanitation collection. We're used to you putting your trash can out every Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever it is, and then the city comes and picks up the trash can all the time, the garbage truck, right? All of that's where it kind of that begins in that 1875 Public Health Act. So what we're seeing here is now government getting involved in economics and saying, no, we need to make sure things are cleaner and better. So this kind of is where this begins, this kind of, sanitation issues and health issues. Another thing connected with this is the man named Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur, I'm assuming a lot of you have heard of him before from this term, pasteurization. Louis Pasteur was a chemist in the 1800s from France, and he developed this idea of pasteurization. Why is this important? Well, you pasteurize certain foods, especially milk. And other foods that make them cleaner and safer to eat. And so as the years go by, governments begin to institute regulations for certain foods that they have to be pasteurized. Now, I want to kind of think about this in a little bit more critical way because on the surface, everyone says, well, this is good. Yeah, of course government should do this, right? But there's a whole other way of thinking about this, and I always like to give you kind of different ways of looking at things. Yes, the obvious thing is if you don't have government do this, then people get sick. But there's another approach, and the other approach is kind of this free market approach, which is you don't need governments to force people to put running waters in a building or force people to, pasteurize their milk. And the reason is this. If you have a choice between buying pasteurized milk and not pasteurized milk, and you know the pasteurized milk won't kill you and the other one will make you sick, are you going to pay more money to buy the pasteurized milk? And most people would say, yes, I'm going to pay a little bit more to buy the milk that won't make me sick, right? So instead of the government enforcing it, the moment you have this new technology of pasteurization, then what happens is if a company refuses to do this, then somebody else comes in, makes the milk a little bit more expensive. But what happens to the other company that doesn't pasteurize their milk? Well, they go out of business, right? Now, of course, that doesn't work if you have a monopoly, right? If you have a monopoly, then that's a problem, right? As that was one of the issues. Or in the meantime, until that other company comes along, that creates a problem as well. Now, you go, why would you wait? Why would you do this? Because if you allow the government to do it, then as anybody knows, whoever runs a business, I think Ronald Reagan said, the worst thing a businessman ever wants to hear is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. It doesn't end with small things. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger until the regulations become suffocating. And that's where the issue is. And this is this kind of challenge that we've had as a society since the Industrial Revolution. How much government regulation is good, how much government regulation is too much, and finding that balance between making sure there's this kind of safety net and protection and regulations that could suffocate people' his ability to grow and thrive, right? And that's a balancing act. This next example is from U.S. history, but it's still a good one. A man named Upton Sinclair, and maybe you've heard of him before. He wrote this book called The Jungle. He was part of a group of people known as the Muckrakers. Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, he nicknamed them the Muckrakers because they would go around raking up the muck and, exposing all the bad things in society. And so in his book, The Jungle, in 1906, he was describing a meatpacking industry. I'm going to read to you just a short little paragraph here. He says the following: there was never the least attention paid to what was cut off from sausage that would come all the way back from Europe. Old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be doused with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat stored in great piles and rooms, and water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handful of dry dung of rats. These rats were a nuisance, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. Yummy, it's a hot dog. Basically, you get this kind of really horrific examples of what was happening. Fingers being cut off, mixed in the meat. Well, he writes this in 1906. What do you get in 1907 that we still have today? The FDA, right? The Food and Drug Administration. And again, you go, well, it's good we have the FDA. The FDA regulates foods and drugs and makes sure they're safe. And on the surface, that's true. But if you think about it deeper, are there any problems? There's positives and negatives with everything. There's positives and negatives with the Industrial Revolution, and there's positives and negatives with the progressive years. Because if you have an FDA that is too restrictive, think of what that slows down. Development of drugs. There are drugs that, can maybe save somebody's lives that the FDA haven't approved because they have to go through all these testings and things that you can go get in other countries. So if you're getting close to death, you're not worried about the detailed regulations. You want the drug that might help you. And so there are all sorts of things like that that sometimes happen through the FDA. So it's, again, that balancing act. All right, you don't want to live in a society where there's no regulations at all, and a society with too much regulations can be very difficult. All right, so anyways, that's the issues of health and sanitation that are part of the progressive years. So hopefully all that's clear as good examples. Now, as a result of all this combined, will things begin to improve? And the answer is, of course, yes. And this is going to come back to this theme of optimism. You have the Industrial Revolution, and now they're starting to deal with some of the negatives, and that combination is going to really help bring about this feeling in Europe that, hey, we could even deal with the negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So that'll be kind of a more positive thing as well. Right, labor conditions, those things needed to improve for sure. One of the things that we see during the Industrial Revolution is labor conditions improving dramatically. During the Industrial Revolution, the average work week was 75 hours a week. By the time we get through the progressive years, that's down to 55 hours per week. Age limits. There are now limits in almost all Western civilization countries where you have to be at least 12 years of old age before you can work. So those are things that help. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happened from a few factors. Some were government laws, so government regulations again. Some came from the free market system. A lot of people don't realize this. That's why I put this there. The whole minimum wage and 40-hour work week, where did that start from? That actually started from Ford, right? Ford is this horrible guy actually. He built the didn't build the car, did the assembly line and all that. And he was the one who decided I'm going to give minimum wage and 40-hour work week. Not because he was a nice guy, because his thought was if I only make my workers work 40 hours a week, I'm going to get the best workers. I'm going to make the best, most efficient car. I'm going to make most money. And that's how the minimum wage and 40-hour work week started. There's this constant discussion today about raising the minimum wage. And I want you to think about what happens if you raise the minimum wage really, really, really high. There's consequences to that. And the consequences oftentimes hurt younger workers because if you raise minimum wage so high that a company can, get a machine that says, would you like fries with that? They're not going to hire you. And if you're a low skilled person, because younger people are lower skilled people because you haven't had the time in life to develop a trade or develop, something really strong to help you succeed in life. It takes time, takes years to develop that. That first rung of that ladder is taken away from you, and it's harder to find those jobs. That minimum wage job that you get in McDonald's is a great job, guys, right? Whatever it is, you learn a lot of things about life, dealing with people, showing up on time, everything you need to do to succeed in life from those jobs are great. But if you tell somebody I'm going to make you pay this much money for somebody that when they have a gluttonous number of people who could do it, it's going to backfire sometimes. Also, costs, right? What does this do to cost if you raise the minimum wage too high, if the government forces it? The best approach is for letting the free market work. And, if you have very few people who could do this, people are going to have to pay somebody more, right? And that's the ideal approach. Again, that isn't always perfect, but, there's issues with the minimum wage. The other big issue that I always like to talk about that help working conditions is the growth of unions. So this is pretty important because are unions around today? And the answer is yes. So let me give you a little background, make sure you know what a union is, how it works, so get all these details down. So unions are really born during the progressive years. A union is a group of people who work in the same profession, right? For the same company usually, or the same industry. And the way a union works is the strongest power a union has is to what we call bargain collectively, right? You want to know that term, bargain collectively. What does that term bargain collectively mean? Well, if I'm not in a union, I go to my boss and say, boss, I want to raise. The boss will say, no. All right, what am I going to do? It's just me. If I'm in a union, I represent everybody in the company. And I go to the boss, say, boss, we want raise. That's bargaining collectively. Because then if the boss says no, then I go back and I say, the boss said no, then what do we all do? We can all say, we're all going to go on strike. And then the boss has a problem because every single worker stops working. That's the power of bargaining collectively. It's a very powerful thing. Now, during the beginning of the unions in the early progressive years, it was kind of all bark, no bite, because if you go on strike, the boss could just fire you and hire other people. It's a little bit of a pain, but he could do that. Today, unions are much stronger. Today, if you're in a union and you try to bargain collectively and you don't want to get what you want, you go on strike. The boss can't fire you. He can hire other replacements in the meantime, but he can't fire you, and he has to deal with you, right, until a negotiation is set. So this is really important. So there's exceptions. You can be fired if you're in a union for safety issues. So for example, back in the 1980s, there was a very famous situation where the air traffic controllers said, we're going on strike. And President Ronald Reagan at the time said, no, you're not. And they said, yes, we are. And he says, no, you're not. And they went on strike, and he fired them like really, really quick. And they hired new people because we're not going to have planes coming down from the sky. And so there are things like that where you're not technically allowed to strike, even if you're in a union. But for most part, teachers unions, supermarket union, whatever it is, unions they're allowed to strike. So are unions powerful? And they are. And are they good or bad? Well, there's both. So let's start with the good. Why are unions good, right? Well, unions are good because they provide better pay. You can just jot all these points down. There are a few points, right? Number one, they provide better pay for people. Number two, better working conditions, safer working conditions, right? Three, better hours, right? That's something unions can help provide for people. So better pay, better conditions, working conditions, better hours, health coverage, all of these things that make working better for you. So they are very good. They provide more job security. Those are all the good things unions do. But there's negatives of unions as well. What are some of the negatives, right? So I want you to know the positives and the negatives. I think it's one of your possible IDs. And just like with the Industrial Revolution, positives and negatives. Unions, positives and negatives. So those were the positives. What are the negatives? Well, one of the problems with unions you're going to have is if you're in a union, you have to pay dues, right? Now, okay, as long as the dues go to the appropriate place, it's not a problem. But there's this old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Remember we used it earlier in the semester with the church? Well, it's the same thing with unions. And as unions get very big and powerful, those union dues are not always going to help the workers. They're going to the union leaders, and there's a lot of corruption involved, and that's a problem. Job security, that's a negative. I thought you said it was a positive. Well, it's a positive and a negative. It's a positive, but it's also a negative. Why is it a negative? Because what if you're incompetent in your job and your union's giving you job security? Who gets hurt? Well, the public, right? Especially if it's a public union like teachers' unions. I mean, one of the hardest things to do is fire a bad teacher. And that's because the teachers' union is so strong. Let me share you a little story here. This is actually something I've been sharing since I started to teach 20 years ago at Cypress College, or it was year 2000 when I started to teach there. So anyways, right when I started to teach there, the union sends a letter to everybody who's, working in United faculty. And it was this letter and it basically says, what if I don't want to be in the teachers union? Do I have to be in the teachers union? And this is what the letter says. So follow me on this. It says, this summer, all non-members, people who don't want to be in the union, will be sent a letter informing them of the decision to implement fair share, or as it also known as agency fee. So non-members will be given a choice of joining United faculty or remaining as non-members. If they remain as non-members, however, they will be required to pay the same amount of money as members, but will not receive the benefits of membership. Okay? Go back and hear that again if you want. So you get it? The union was so strong that they could even tell teachers, if you choose not to be in the union, you're not going to get the benefits of the union, but you're still going to have to pay dues. And you go, that doesn't even make sense. How does that happen? Well, the way that happened is the union has got a lot of money. They go to politicians. They give money to politicians to pass laws like that to make them even stronger. Now, this was reversed. It was reversed in about the year 2018, but it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was a very famous ruling called the Janus ruling. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't tell people who are not in the union you have to pay dues. But that took a long time to go through the Supreme Court. So that's one of the negatives of unions as well, is there's going to be corruption. They could force people to pay dues who don't even want to be in the union. They protect bad workers. The public sometimes gets hurt. So there's good and there's bad, right? And it's, again, finding that balance. So anyways, those are a few things about labor conditions. But overall, by the time the progressive years end, you do see working hours much less, about 20 hours a week less than they were during the Industrial Revolution. So that's a pretty big improvement. All right, now there are some other changes during the progressive years that have nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. So I just want to run through a few kind of life culture things. And so one of the big changes that happens during the progressive years is the women's suffrage movement. Maybe many of you heard of the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, 1848. where they gathered, women gathered. Remember Olympe de Gouges, we talked about her earlier during the French Revolution, and there was this kind of beginnings. Well, now you have a more serious push. There were women like this woman you see here named Emmeline Pankhurst who organized what is called the WSPU. That stands for the Women's Social Political Union, the Women's Social Political Union. And her approach was a little bit interesting. She didn't have little meetings like Seneca Falls. Her approach was to basically go through England and with a little group of militia women and smashy things and break things, demanding women should have the right to vote. Well, eventually women do get the right to vote, and actually, this is kind of a fun little question to ask yourself. Can any guesses of where women first got the right to vote in the world? And it's actually nowhere in Europe. It's not the United States. The first country to give women the right to vote was actually New Zealand. That was the first place that gave women the right to vote. And, after that, it was countries like Australia and then a lot of European countries. I think New Zealand was 1893 was the first place to give women the right to vote. And to give you perspective, when did women get the right to vote in the U.S.? That was until after World War I, right? Around 1919, 1920. And there were some states that gave women the right to vote way before that, but on a federal level, not until after World War I. So, a little bit longer. But it was a big change in society, obviously. So that's a pretty big development during the progressive years, the whole women's suffrage movement. So definitely something worth noting. Family changes. All right. So here's a couple things we have talked about before. Why you marry, who you marry. Well, in the Middle Ages, you marry someone because your parents do. In the Renaissance, you marry someone because your parents do. In Life in the 1700s lecture, we talked about marrying someone because your parents do. Told you to. Well, now we're in the 1800s, and now we have Romanticism. We're going to talk a lot more about Romanticism in our next lecture. It's much more than this, but part of this Romanticism movement is the first time in Western civilization history this idea of marrying who you want to marry. And so, there's still a lot of, even today, if you think about it, you always marry exactly who you want to marry, and, parents and culture issues and religious issues and all these other things. But this idea of arranged marriage by your parents in Western civilization starts to come to an end in the 1800s. So that's part of the progressive years. So that's pretty important. That's one of the big changes in society that still obviously impacts us today. Another really interesting change that's worth noting is child education. For the first time, child education becomes mandatory, where now it's not like Napoleon where he says, hey, go to school if you want. No, you have to send your kids to school. When does that begin? Again, during the progressive years, around the year circa 1870. Austria was the first country to make mandatory education. In other words, you must send your children to school at least to like the age of 12. And then other countries followed, the United States as well, like early 1900s. And so mandatory education. And kind of an interesting side note on that, when you look at our education system for K through 12 and even college, you ever wonder why you have this system where you go to school and you start in September and then you end in, like May or June, and then you have June, July, August off. And then you come back from third grade to fourth grade and you basically forgot everything. And what's the deal with that? Well, the reason that happened, it was because of the way the education system developed during these years. And there was one group of people who really opposed mandatory education. It was parents. And you go, why would parents oppose that? Because they wanted their kids to work. And so the deal was, okay, we'll send kids to school, but they could have the harvest season off. To do what? Not to have a vacation to go and play, but to work the fields. And so that's why we have this kind of antiquated system of having these long months break between first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and so forth. So it's kind of a little tangent, but interesting little story. But that's the time where you have mandatory education. So that's part of the progressive years. All right, next, leisure activities. So this is fun. What do you do during the progressive years for fun? Well, a lot of the same things we do today for fun. And so professional sports, this is something that could never happen before the progressive years and the Industrial Revolution. You couldn't have football or soccer in Europe. You couldn't have things like basketball. I don't know if you've heard a man named James Naismith here, but James Naismith invented basketball. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. Or the modern Olympic Games, 1896. And so these are things that now become commonplace. Professional sport leagues, baseball, basketball, and regular attendance of 100,000 people. Why couldn't you do that before these periods of time? Well, you needed the Industrial Revolution to be able to move. I mean, how can you have leagues between teams in Florida and New York playing? Everyone's going to get on their horse and ride from one city to another. Not going to happen, right? You need the trains. You need stadiums, right? You can't just have one stadium. You need stadiums everywhere. You know, drive within a 20, 30-mile radius of wherever you live. How many big stadiums are there? And there's probably a dozen or so, right? You have to have that. You can't do that without the Industrial Revolution. You need the progressive years because you need people to have time. If you're working 75 hours a week, you don't even have time to think of recreational activities, let alone sports. And so it's the combination of the Industrial Revolution and the progressive years that helps this kind of modern professional sports leisure activity begin. The other thing is, of course, this becomes a big business, right? You know, if you think about sports today, they're multi-trillion-dollar industries if you take it all over the globe. So that's one. Another big industry, movies. You have the movie projector, right? And so you first time, and can you imagine the first time you'd watch a movie? Must have been pretty amazing for people. It's like, oh, there are these people moving in front of me and they're not really here. And so movies, that's something that's new that we still do today. Another leisure activity that we still do today that develops is tourism, right? And there was a man named Thomas Cook. I'll show you a picture of him in a second too. Thomas Cook is considered kind of the founder of the tourist industry. And what he did is he organized tours from England to other parts of Europe where you'd have like organized tours. Again, you couldn't do that before the Industrial Revolution and the progressive years. You needed the ability to mass move people. You needed the time. You needed the financial resources that you have from, the capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. You needed all of that for mass tourism to take place. So you have that as something that's a leisure activity we still do today. New forms of writing. One of my favorites, science fiction writing. Very famous. There's a lot of them, but Jules Verne is the example I always use. Get all these three of these down. He wrote all of them. Journey to the Center of the Earth, Around the Moon, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. You don't need specific dates for all of them. They're all about the 1860s, 1870 period when he's writing all three of these. And, it's really amazing that he is doing this because I don't know how familiar you are, but when you read the writings of Jules Verne, he's writing science fiction, but a lot of the things he wrote about actually happen. He writes about travel, space travel, rockets, submarines, TV, all of these things that end up happening. And it's pretty remarkable. And I think there's also a reality of really this kind of optimism again, that if you had Jules Verne, right, 100 years earlier, people would have read his stuff and go, what the hell, this guy's whacked out of his brain crazy. But now when he's writing this during the progressive year, 1860s, 1870s, people are reading it and go, maybe we can get to the moon. Maybe we could go 20,000 leagues under the sea. Anything is possible. And so there's this new genre of science fiction writing that develops as a result of the progressive years. So that's pretty cool as well. So these are all really kind of new positive things that come out of the progressive years as well. And again, if you're this individual living this 100-year period we talked about, these are pretty cool developments. This is just a picture of James Naismith. This is a little funny story. So when he did the basketball, he used a peach basket. And the story goes that, he had the peach basket up and they put it up 10 feet, right? And the same height it is today. The thing is, he never cut a hole on the bottom, so you throw the ball in and then the ball would kind of get stuck in here and then somebody had to get on the ladder, get the peach basket. And somebody said, hey, let's cut a hole there on the bottom. And then when they cut the hole in the bottom, then it makes the game a lot better. But anyways, that's James Naismith. He worked at a YMCA and created basketball. That's Thomas Cook. Looks a little creepy, this dude, but he's the founder of the tourist industry. So you have him. And, just last slide, just again to reemphasize the optimism, just a few quick things. 1876, this guy named Bell invents the telephone. again, try to imagine being able to hear somebody's voice for the first time. We take this for granted. For me, like I remember the first time years ago, I was able to video chat with somebody, and I was like, "Whoa, this is cool! I'm video chatting with relatives in other countries," and it was pretty neat, right? For them, it was the phone. 1877, Edison, the light bulb, turn night into day with a flick of a switch. That was just must have been stunning. And 1885, two brothers invent the car. And these two brothers were named Benz. And just as a little bit of a trivia, one of them had a daughter named Mercedes. That's where you get Mercedes Benz from. But they technically invent the combustible engine. The car is kind of what we give them credit for that. It's not Ford again. Ford creates the assembly line. And of course, what was in the early 1900s, two other brothers start soaring the sky for, with planes, right? Air travel, the Wright brothers. And so it's just absolutely stunning to see all these things happening this quickly. And so this is all part of that optimism that was part of the progressive years, again, when you combine it with the Industrial Revolution. Is it perfect for everyone? No. Are there still issues for a lot of people? Yes. That's kind of a no-brainer. There's obviously no utopia. Again, you're never going to create a utopia, and I think I've said this before. The enemy of good is perfection. And so, but things are improving, and for a lot of people, it is one of the more optimistic times in history. I mean, compared to the period of the Black Death or the Industrial Revolution without these changes, or other issues in other times. You're having all these Enlightenment changes as well still happening, more democratic rules. So these are gradual changes. Things don't change overnight, and this evolution has been pretty positive for a lot of people. So that's the progressive years. Hopefully you got a few good bits of information out of that. And then we have a little bit more lecturing to do, and then your midterms. So we only have like one other topic before the midterm, what we call 19th century ideologies. And I'll pop that up early next for your next one, and then after that you'll have your midterm. All right, that's it, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.